It was Halloween. My mom and dad had gone to an adult Halloween party at their friend's house and left me, a 14-year-old male, and my sister home alone to hand out candy to the neighborhood kids. We lived on a small farm surrounded by other small farms, and Halloweens were pretty mellow. My sister was 12 and had finally gotten to the age where she thought trick-or-treating and dressing up was embarrassing, and I just liked staying home and playing video games with my friends, so I didn't usually go out on Halloween. The only issue that night was my parents had forgotten to get candy, so they told us to hand out whatever fruit or pretzels we had in the kitchen. And that was so embarrassing for me, having to give kids something they didn't want on the one night of the year that they were supposed to be getting candy. I wasn't too worried about it, given that not many kids lived in our area, so we figured that we wouldn't have to answer the door much at all. We handed out the first batch of apples to disappointed kids, and by 11 p.m., we assumed that we were done for the night. Then came a knock at the door. It was late, and I didn't really want to answer the door again, but I figured it was just little kids, and I didn't want to be rude and ignore them when they could see that the lights were on inside. I got to the door and pulled it open, and was shocked to see 4 very tall guys standing there, all en masse, holding their pillowcases open, seemingly expecting candy. "Sorry guys, we don't have any candy. We've been handing out apples to the kids all night. Might have some pretzels if you want some." The tallest one in front just tilted his head at me almost like he was confused by what I was saying, but none of them actually spoke. I didn't really know what else to do, so I started to close the door. When I went to shut it all the way, one of the guys put his shoe between the door and the door frame to prevent me from closing it. I opened the door again to ask him what his problem was, but instead, he and his friends just pushed their way inside. I yelled for my sister to run and hide before being shoved to the ground. One of the intruders pulled out a bat out from under his robe and in a low, deep voice said, "We didn't come for any candy." I managed to get onto my hands and knees before being kicked in the stomach, knocking me to the ground once again. I tried screaming, but the thing about living on a farm with more land between you and your neighbors than the average neighborhood is no one is going to hear you scream when you need help, but I kept screaming anyways. "It's Halloween. You really think anyone's going to think twice about a kid screaming?" And this made the rest of them laugh behind their masks. "Look, I don't know what you want, but I can give you money if you just leave. Please, you don't need to hurt anyone." I expected a response, but he just laughed at my shaky voice. In a baby talk voice, one of the guys said, "Aw, look, the little baby's scared. Where's Daddy to save you when you need him?" I felt a stinging at my side as the guy with the bat swung it directly into my ribs. I was trying to listen to the voices to figure out how old they were, and from what I could tell, they seemed young enough to be teenagers. There was a lot of thoughts going through my mind in that moment. I mean, they definitely weren't mature at all, and I crawled to the corner of the room in pain as they spoke to each other about what rooms they would go in and what they were going to take. One of the guys took me outside while the others looked around the house for whatever it was they wanted. I saw my sister on the roof, hiding outside her window from the man that I could see had just entered her room. The guy that took me outside had me by the collar of my shirt and was leading me toward the barn. He opened the door to the pig pen and pushed me inside. Threatening me with the bat, he made me roll around in the mud and film me as he forced me to oink. I was terrified, exhausted, confused, embarrassed, and felt completely humiliated at what I was being forced to do. The guy was laughing the whole time, too. He told me to get up and let me out of the barn and back inside the house to show the rest of his friends what he'd done to me. And they only just joined in the torment. They made me drink the toilet water, eat trash from the trash can, and other things I can't even speak of as they pulled me around. The whole time I was just hoping they wouldn't find my sister. The strange thing is, they hadn't even mentioned her once. They took me to my room and began taking turns throwing punches. I had no idea what I had done to deserve this horrible beating and torture that I was being put through. I was just going through torture in my mind, and I had no idea. I almost blacked out many times. 10 minutes into the beating, I heard one of them ask me where my sister was. They told me that they wanted to have some fun with her and that they'd stop hurting me if I told them. and this was the moment I decided to stop talking completely. They could hurt me all they wanted. I was not letting them near my sister. They asked me again, spitting in my face each time I refused to talk, but there was nothing they could do to me that would get me to give her up. Eventually, they tied me to a chair in the kitchen and just exited the house after thoroughly trashing the place. And I must have blacked out at some point because when I woke up, I was in the hospital attached to just a bunch of machines. My mom was crying when she noticed me awake and took her time to tell me exactly what happened. It turns out the girl I had just broken up with the week before asked her brother to scare me as revenge for hurting her. I guess he and his friends were just insane for taking it to the extent that they did. I guess they just got caught up in it, as disgusting as that sounds. Thankfully, they were all arrested, but only the brother was actually sentenced to some jail time. He received 5 years for aggravated assault and home invasion charges. The other guys got probation as a plea deal for ratting him out. I'm still in a lot of pain since this happened less than a year ago, but I guess there's one thing I'd tell kids answering the door for Halloween when their parents aren't home. Always check your peephole first. I'm a cow farmer in the Midwest. It's not the best work, but it is work, and with how hard it is to find a job with decent pay these days, I've learned to appreciate it. The job entails cleaning up after the cows, checking their hooves, milking, and helping them give birth when necessary. It's a pretty messy job when you look at it from the outside, but I've gotten pretty used to it. I don't even smell the stink anymore like I did when I first started. It used to be almost unbearable, but now, really nothing. The farm was my father's before me and his father's before him. And the story I'm about to tell you is my dad's. He told it to me back when I first started the job as almost what not to do when tending to the animals and working on the farm. He's long passed now, God rest his soul, but this story has haunted me for years, so I figured I'd let other people hear it and judge it for themselves. This is back in the 60s when Dad was in his early 20s. He worked on the farm with his father, Bill, at the time. He hated it. He hated the stench that would only get worse when the heat came in the summer, and picking up after the cows was the worst. See, the cows stayed in this huge barn. It was actually more like a big warehouse where they're fed and kept throughout the night. They got to graze during the day, and throughout the night the cows would defecate and their feces drop to the concrete floor beneath them. Then in the morning, when the cows would go out to graze, my dad would take a really long hose and spray the droppings to the end of the building down a shaft that leads to a big tank below the barn. The tank would fill with the droppings, and once a week we had a guy that would come by and empty the tank and dispose of the waste. It was really nasty work, but my dad did it nonetheless. Well, my grandfather decided that it was just too much work to do on the farm with just himself and my dad, so they decided to hire another farmhand. They didn't get anyone interested in the job for the first few weeks until they met a man at a local feed store named Fred. He was in his late 20s and eager to work. He hadn't had a job in years and was desperate for pay since his wife was pregnant with their first child. My grandfather hired him right there in that feed store, and by the next day, Fred was on the farm working harder than anyone my dad had ever seen work. He was determined and super ambitious. He was constantly running around the farm fixing stuff that needed fixing and trying to learn absolutely everything it was that they did. He loved the job and told everyone how he just wanted to be good at what he was being paid to do. He believed in good, honest work and that people should earn the money they're working for. My dad admitted he loved having Fred around, not just because he worked hard, but also because he was gullible and pretty easily manipulated, I guess. My dad had certain tasks given to him by my grandpa throughout the day, and each time he was told to do something, he just passed that task along to Fred. He didn't mind because he didn't know, and my dad didn't care because it meant less of the work that he hated. About 4 months went by with Fred doing most of the work around the farm, and my dad even started to find it a little funny that he really would do whatever he was told. Without question, he was happy to do it. One hot summer morning, the cows had just gone out to graze, and my grandpa told my dad to spray the droppings down the shaft at the end of the barn like he usually did. My dad then passed the job along to Fred as he sat along the side of the barn to have a smoke. When Fred was done, he came outside to tell my dad that he had an idea that he thought would highly benefit the farm. He told my dad that if he emptied the tank below the barn themselves, they would be able to use the cow feces as manure in the fields. It would fertilize the plants and make them grow bigger and faster. My dad told me that at first he thought the idea was stupid, but then he figured it would be funny to see if Fred actually tried and emptied that feces tank, so he agreed. He didn't tell my grandpa because he knew he never would have approved, and he just wanted to see how this would play out. He showed Fred where to go to the release valve and empty the tank into the big barrels. He told him to be very careful and to not turn the valve too fast, otherwise the line would get clogged and they'd have to call someone to fix it. My dad then left Fred alone to do what he had planned and decided to take a walk around the barn to check the gates and make sure everything was in order. What my dad didn't know at the time was that Fred would end up turning the valve too fast, and the line would end up getting clogged. Fred would then open the tank from above and reach a pole into the sludge to try and dislodge whatever was blocking the line. My dad heard screaming coming from inside the barn and he rushed over to see what was wrong. He made his way down into the tank and was horrified by what he found. Fred had fallen into the huge 5,000-gallon tank that hadn't been emptied for a week and was now drowning in the thick feces, desperately reaching out for help. By the time my dad got to the top of the ladder and looked into the tank, all he could see was Fred's hand poking out of the brown goo. He grabbed onto it and tried pulling him out, but he had no leverage at all on the top of that tank. He managed to pull Fred up long enough for him to tell my dad that he was just trying to fix it himself since he knew that they'd have to pay someone for his mistake. He felt bad, and my dad reassured him everything would be okay and to just hold on. And that's when his grip failed and Fred plunged back under the thick excrement once again. This time, no part of Fred's body was able to be grabbed onto to possibly rescue him. My dad had no idea what to do, so he ran across the farm as fast as he could to get my grandpa, who immediately called the police. And by the time they made it back to the tank, Fred's hand had disappeared under the sludge, and there was nothing my dad and grandpa could do but wait. The police showed up with firemen, and they didn't know much of what to do either. They ended up reaching a metal pole down into the tank with a sort of loop on the end, and when they pulled Fred out, it was very clear that he had passed. My dad was horrified and felt like it was his fault. He knew it was a bad idea, but thought it would be funny. He could have stopped Fred, but his own arrogance let him do it. Fred's wife became a widow and she never remarried. She named their son after him and eventually moved out of town. My dad made a point to work as hard as Fred did every day for the rest of his life in honor of the man whose death he felt he was responsible for. My dad passed away in 2018, and the last thing he said to me was to never take advantage of someone's hard work. It was March 28, 2000. My husband Robin and I had just moved to Fort Worth, Texas from Seattle, Washington. My husband had just gotten a job offer that he was really excited about. In his words, he just couldn't pass it up. He's an architect, and the firm he wanted to work at was down there, and I couldn't say no. He was so happy, and I was so happy for him. We had 4 children, a 13-year-old boy named Josh, a 10-year-old girl named Jamie, a 7-year-old April, and our youngest, a 3-year-old girl named Paula. Our kids were super excited. They had heard of cowboys on TV, and they kept telling all their friends that they were moving onto a farm with a bunch of animals and that they were going to be farmers. It was really cute. When we first got to our house on the farm, everything was very peaceful. We moved in early March and got mostly settled about 2 weeks later. We didn't have any animals on the farm, since we were still in the process of getting into a routine with the kids. Their school was about a 15-minute drive from our house, and we weren't comfortable at the time sending them on the bus. March 28th started out regular, just like every other Tuesday we'd spent in the house thus far. We got the kids ready for school and headed out the door. My husband went to work, and I came back with Paula. She was like a mini-me in every way, followed me everywhere. I adored her, and I like to think she adored me. On his way back from work, my husband picked up the kids from school. They got ice cream on the way home and were pretty riled up from the sugar rush. When they came inside, I had them do their homework, and as soon as they were finished, we sat down to watch some TV. It was in the evening hours of the day when all the chaos started. Sirens began blaring all around us. We lived in Seattle all our lives, so we'd never really experienced anything like that before. My husband immediately recognized it as a tornado warning, and he told us all to get into the bathroom and close the door. Our house had no basement or shelter, so we had to make do with what we had. I'd never even considered tornadoes could be in our future when we'd planned to move. All 6 of us huddled into the bathroom. We laid on top of one another to try and hold each other down just in case. My husband was on top, shielding us with his body. The house started to shake, and our daughters started to cry and scream. Paula was grabbing onto me as tight as she could. Josh was trying to act brave, but I knew that he was terrified. The look in his eyes as he stared back at me said it all. The sounds of windows breaking and debris flying had become louder and louder as the minutes passed. I was praying for my children's lives, for all our lives. This was not our time to die, I thought. All I could think about as the ground shook underneath us was how they still had so much of their lives left to live. I wanted to see them grow, graduate high school and college, fall in love, get married, have a family of their own someday. I was terrified of the thought of that possibility not happening. After being in the bathroom for 10 minutes, we felt the house shake like nothing we'd felt before. The roof was torn off in seconds, and now all of us were screaming and terrified. My husband held on to us with all his strength as each gust of wind threatened to pull us up into God knows what and take us who knows where. At this point, I was terrified, crying and holding on to whatever piece of clothing or body part I could grab on to keep our kids safe underneath us and away from the danger that was looming above, screaming like a highway. Suddenly, I felt Paula begin slipping out of my hold. I had started to scream her name to try and get my husband's attention, but when I looked over, he wasn't there. I grabbed onto Paula and managed to put her back underneath me, not before she hit her head pretty hard against the wall from the wind pushing her. She went completely silent and was no longer crying. I knew something was wrong, but I just had to focus on the situation at hand and get her help when the time came. I was worried about my husband. I hadn't even noticed that he'd been taken away by the storm. I prayed and prayed that he would be okay as I put the full weight of my body on my children's to keep them weighed down and out of harm's way. After what felt like eternity, the storm rolled on, and the wind finally slowed down and everything became silent. We all got up out of our positions and I picked up Paula. She had been completely limp and I noticed blood trailing down the side of her head, and tears rolled down my face as I assumed the worst. At this point, I was thinking that I lost my husband and one of our children. We walked out of the bathroom and into the rubble that was once our home. I found my husband lying in the front yard, obviously thrown there by the wind. I could see him, gasping for air as I rushed over to him. I held his head in my hands and I told him how much I loved him, and the first thing he asked between gasps was if the kids were okay. I told him Paula had gotten hurt and I could see the worry in his eyes. Thank God, we did get help soon after from the disaster relief team. We had no way of calling anyone and our cars had been thrown by the wind, so all we could do was wait until they showed up and found us. We were all taken to the hospital, and myself, Josh, Jamie, and April had minor cuts and bruises, but I'm so grateful to say that both my husband and Paula survived. Paula had extensive brain damage and still to this day requires around-the-clock care, which is incredibly sad for the circumstances, but I'm just thankful to God that she's still with us. My husband broke multiple bones throughout his body, but he did recover fully within about a year. We're just so thankful that they both survived. The whole incident was just so terrifying that we decided moving back to Seattle was our best option. Our families were there, and my husband got another job offer that he said was just as good. Our lives were forever changed that day, and we hope we never have to experience anything as terrifying as that ever again. Alright, I'll just start from the very beginning. I was around 12 years old when this happened. I'm 33 now, but thinking about what happened that night still gives me goosebumps. For context, I think I should mention that I grew up on a very large farm in the middle of nowhere in southern Idaho. It wasn't in the mountains like you might be thinking. It was just grass and hills for miles. My mom and dad were both raised in big cities, so when they got married, they figured they'd give their kids more of a farm life to grow up in, and I always loved it. We had goats, chickens, ducks, turkeys, you name it, we had it. The only thing I didn't have was much more freedom from my parents. My dad was a goat farmer and his job was working on the farm. He sold goat milk, made cheese, and of course sold the meat. My mom was just a stay-at-home mother, so she was also around all the time, which basically meant I had no alone time and no privacy. When I was little, I didn't mind much. I loved having my parents around. I helped my dad with the farm work and taking care of all the animals, and I was always in the kitchen baking and cooking with my mom. But by the time I reached middle school, I was ready to grow up and, I guess, do what every kid does when they hit puberty. Just kind of pull away from your parents, I guess. It was hard and my parents hated it. I think that's because my brother was so much older than me and had already left the house by that point. I was their little baby girl and they weren't quite ready for the teenager rebellious phase to hit yet. Every weekend we would go out to dinner as a family. We would meet up with my brother and his girlfriend and it was actually really fun. This night though, I just wanted to stay home. My mom insisted that I go with them and when I refused, she offered to stay with me so I wouldn't be alone. I begged and begged her to just let me stay there alone and finally after what felt like forever, she agreed. My dad wasn't happy about it, but she told him everything would be fine. If I needed anything, I could just call. They were only going to be around a 45-minute drive to the city, and I was ecstatic. I felt like for the first time in my life I was free. That night my mom and dad gave me a hug and a kiss and said their goodbyes. They gave me the rundown that all parents give when leaving their kids home alone for the first time, such as cell phone numbers, the restaurant they'd be at, calling 911 for an emergency, etc., etc. It went in one ear and out the other. I was just looking forward to staying up late and watching shows I wasn't supposed to watch. You know, normal kid stuff. I should also mention that we had a German Shepherd named Ghost at the time. He was an all-white German Shepherd and I always thought he looked more like a wolf. My parents got him when I was just a baby and we grew up together. He was like my shadow. I'm sure having him around also gave my parents some peace of mind when leaving me that night. My mom and dad finally left at around 7 p.m. and I was excited. I heard my parents pull out of the driveway and I was on the couch in seconds. Ghost joined me and we watched some TV for a while. About an hour went by and nothing of significance happened. I watched some stupid TV shows on MTV that my parents didn't normally allow and ate some candy that I'd saved up from Easter a couple of weeks before. An important thing to mention is we didn't have any curtains on any of our windows. We lived in the middle of nowhere and we weren't really worried about anyone seeing in. Plus, my mom loved the morning sun shining in through the windows without her having to go around the whole house opening them. After it had been around an hour and a half since my parents left, my mom called to tell me that they wouldn't be home when they had originally said because my brother and his girlfriend also wanted to see a movie with them that night. She told me she'd come home to be with me if being home alone longer made me uncomfortable, but honestly, I was super happy that I'd be getting a few extra hours of alone time, so I told her I'd be fine and to go enjoy the movie. During one of the show's commercial breaks, I rushed into the kitchen to get a bowl of ice cream. I heard Ghost starting to bark in the living room, but figured that he just saw one of the many bats that were flying around that time of night, so I thought nothing of it. Only this time, he would not stop barking. It got so annoying that I remember yelling at him to stop, but he just wouldn't let up. I walked into the living room and couldn't help but scream when I saw what Ghost was barking at. There was a man standing there, right outside the window. He was wearing a white rubber Halloween mask that had a huge painted smile on the front. I couldn't see his eyes, but oh my God, he was insanely creepy. I froze in pure terror and looked at this man as he stared back at me. I felt tears rolling down my cheeks and I guess my fight or flight kicked in because before I knew it, I was screaming at Ghost to follow me and running upstairs to my parents' bedroom. When I got to the top of the stairs, I just couldn't help myself. I looked back. I had to know if he was still there. He was, only this time his hand was raised and he waved slowly at me, his head tilted upward so I was still in his view. I got into the bedroom and locked the door behind me. At this point, I was bawling. I totally regretted staying alone and all I wanted was my mom and dad. I rushed over to the nightstand and picked up the landline to call my dad, but there was no dial tone. I wasn't too worried about it considering my father had given me a cell phone to use in emergencies, but the only problem was that it was in my room across the hall, and I didn't want a chance going back to where this masked man could see me. I had no other option, though. I was not just going to wait around for my parents to come back hours later with this man just feet from me outside the house. I mustered up every bit of courage I had, unlocked the bedroom door, and I ran as fast as I could. And in the 10 seconds it took me to get to my room, I noticed the man wasn't outside the window anymore. The window was open, and he was now standing at the bottom of the stairs. I involuntarily screamed almost as loud as I could and heard his footsteps begin to run up the stairs after me. Ghost began lunging toward the man, barking, which made him hesitate for a moment, and this was long enough for me and Ghost to get into my room and lock the door behind me. I grabbed the phone out of my drawer and dialed 911, desperate for someone to get here as soon as possible. The man outside my door began trying the handle. I watched it jiggle as he tried to get into my room, the whole time, never actually speaking a single word, and I think that's what terrified me even more. The operator answered and barely understood me through my hysteria, but she got the gist and told me that an officer was already in the area and would be there in only 5 minutes. She told me to stay on the line until he showed up, and something in me thought that I should loudly say, "Okay, so an officer will be here in 5 minutes. He'll be here in 5 minutes, right?" The second I spoke those words, all the jiggling and noises stopped. The handle stopped moving, and for all I knew, he had completely left the house. But God, my heart was racing. I knew I wasn't leaving that room until I was sure an officer was there to help me. And just like the operator said, an officer was at my house within that period of time. I saw the lights outside when he pulled up, and I did hear sirens. I heard them enter the house and run up the stairs yelling for the man to get down and to put his hands behind his back. This was just confirmation to me that the man hadn't left, and I was so glad that I hadn't tried to exit my room when I thought that he'd had. They arrested him, and one of them took him away while the other waited with me. I guess they had called my parents who were rushing home. They ended up finding multiple slain goats on the property. They had very clearly been killed with stab wounds scattered across their bodies. When the police found him, he was still standing outside my door, just staring at it, blood on his body. They never even looked at them when they came in. The man never did say why he did this. He actually never spoke at all. After this period of time, we did find out that he was sentenced to 10 years in prison. To our relief, my mom and dad thought of selling the farm and buying another one after that traumatic event, and potentially going to a state across the country where they thought he would never find us if he did eventually get out, whatever his motivations may have been. But the masked man ended up taking his own life in prison before that could ever happen. And to any child out there who wants freedom from their parents when they're still too young, just remember, in your scariest moments, they are the people you wish that were there the most. I'm a fairly cautious individual. I always told myself that I'd never be like other people who get themselves caught in dangerous situations, but that's exactly what happened. I'm a 28-year-old woman, and I currently live with my husband, Sam, and our 3-year-old daughter, Elena. My husband and I both grew up in the area, and when we got married, we decided a nice house on a lot of land would be perfect for us. We'd never been the city living type, and we wanted our daughter to have a lot of space to play. Over the 5 years that we lived here, we purchased a lot of farm animals off Craigslist. We started with chickens, and then pigs, and then eventually goats. Just over a year ago, I suggested to my husband that it would be fun to get a cow. We could milk her, and she wouldn't have to have her calf taken away like most dairy cows, so we felt that we were doing a good thing. After about 6 months with her, we realized that she was just way too much work to take care of for her and her calf, and we wanted them to go to a home that had the time to take proper care of them. I was really sad about letting her go, but I also knew it was the right thing to do. I suggested to my husband that we list her on Craigslist, and he agreed that it was a good idea, so I listed her immediately. We knew she would sell fast given that she milked well and came with her calf. With only a few hours of listing them, we got around 10 emails. We weeded out the scams, and one person stood out to us. They said that they had a 50-acre farm and other dairy cows, so they had experience. They also said that they could pick her up as soon as possible for the exact price that we were asking. We were so happy that they were going to go to such a good home. The only problem was my husband was going out of town for work the next week. He told me multiple times that he was not comfortable with a stranger coming to the farm when he wasn't going to be there, but I was a little too trusting and was positive it would be fine. The people in our area were good people, and I hadn't heard of anything bad coming from animal purchases in the area. The people who were coming told me that they were a husband and wife named John and Betty. In the moment, I did make a little joke to myself that their names were so boring that they almost sounded fake. But the thought passed and it didn't cross my mind again. I gave them our address and told them that they could come to pick up the cows the next day at around 4 p.m. That night, my husband gave my daughter and me a kiss and left for his work trip. My husband was very serious when it came to him leaving us alone. We had set times that we would call each other, and if I missed a call, he would alert the police. It may seem dramatic to some people, but it was our routine, and if it gave him more peace of mind when he left, then I was more than okay with it. The night came and went without incident. I woke up early at around 6 a.m. to let out all the animals to feed and give them water. They were also excited to be out for the day since it rained the day before and they had been cooped up inside. Elena always went out with me in the morning, and it was so cute seeing her interacting with all the animals. I let the cows out for what I thought would be the last time. I rubbed their backs and essentially said my goodbyes. At around 1 p.m., I made Elena and myself something to eat and got her dressed in different clothes for the rest of the night. We then sat on the sofa and waited for 4 o'clock to come when the cows would be picked up. Throughout the day, I'd done my routine calls with my husband to tell him how we were doing, and if I'm being completely honest, I totally regretted letting strangers come to the house without him being there. I started to have this really horrible feeling in the pit of my stomach that I just couldn't shake. John and Betty called to tell me that they were only 5 minutes out, so I went out on the porch to greet them as they pulled up. I had just put Elena down for her nap, so I was completely alone out there. The first thing I noticed when they pulled up was the mask that they were both wearing. I immediately began running back up the steps to my house before hearing one of them yell, "No, no, no, you get back here now." He had a very thick southern accent that was almost hard to understand. I felt something hard being pressed to my back, and I immediately knew it had to be a gun. I asked them with a shaky voice, what do they want, that I didn't have any cash. And they quickly told me to shut up, and if I wanted to live, I'd do exactly as they said. The woman, Betty, had a very raspy voice, almost like she'd smoked for 40+ years. I could tell she was also from the South when she said that you're going to go inside and get every piece of jewelry you own, put it in a bag, and give it straight to me while John here gets whatever he wants, and you won't put up a fight. The first thing I thought of was my daughter. I couldn't let them find Elena. I didn't know what these people were capable of. I told her I'd comply, but I already knew I wouldn't. I really couldn't, and I had to keep my daughter safe. I went inside my house, Betty close behind me as I walked toward the bedroom. My husband kept a shotgun under the bed, and I knew if I could just get to it, I might be able to save my daughter's life and possibly my own too. "I keep my jewelry box under the bed. I need to get under there to grab it, okay?" My voice was calm at that point because I was so worried that she was going to suspect something was up. "Whatever. Just get me what I asked for," she said, and I could feel her spit landing on my face while she talked. She was missing most of her teeth, so I wasn't surprised. Disgusted, but not surprised. I got on my hands and knees on the floor and peered under the bed, and there it was, only inches away. I knew I would have to be fast if I was going to get out of this without getting myself and my daughter killed. In one swift motion, I pulled out the gun, and boom, without thinking or aiming, I fired a shot. The force of the blow made this Betty fly across the room, her chest completely demolished by the blast, and the smell of gunpowder lingered in the room mixed with the scent of her blood, splattered across the walls and on the floor as it oozed out of the large hole that I just put in her chest. She was gone within seconds. It was a double barrel, so I knew whenever John would come running in, I'd only have one chance to take him too. My adrenaline was pumping. I didn't even think of the person that had just died in my bedroom, and all I could think of was keeping my daughter safe. If I died in the process, so be it. John did come in the room yelling for Betty, but he took one look, and before I could get a shot off, he was running down the stairs and out the door screaming Jesus Christ, while his voice cracked seemingly out of sadness. I ran to get Elena and carried her with me to the front porch where we sat. The police showed up 30 minutes later, saying my husband had called and said something was wrong at the house. I hadn't called him at our scheduled time, so he knew something was up, and I could barely talk. I swear that I had gone into shock. I sat there with my daughter while the officers searched the house and found the body upstairs. And it turns out, of course, those names were fake. They were never able to identify the man, but the woman was someone that the officers knew well around the area. She'd been arrested multiple times on drug-related charges. That day was the worst, most traumatizing day of my life, but it taught me a very valuable lesson. Never assume strangers are worthy of your trust, and never underestimate a mother's love for a child. I'm a 17-year-old guy with a pretty interesting life, if I do say so myself. My mom left when I was very young, and my sister and I have been raised by just our dad ever since. We live in a pretty large farm in the Rocky Mountains, and life for the most part is very peaceful. I had some friends who lived nearby by our standards, and I would regularly make the 3-mile walk to their houses to hang out with them. So when I asked my dad that night if I could go, he didn't even think twice when saying yes. I had made plans with my friend Jimmy to sleep over, and I was pretty excited. Plus, the walk is gorgeous in the afternoon sun. I was 14 at the time, so when I packed my backpack, it was only snacks, Monster energy drinks, and some pajamas. I gave my dad a hug and kissed my little sister on the forehead before heading out. The first part of the walk was just through the fields. I remember stopping every so often to take pictures with my disposable camera of the newly developing crops my dad and I had just planted a couple of weeks prior. I regretted wearing only shorts and a tank top as the sun beat down on my very pale skin. I could see myself turning red as the minutes passed, and at the end of our property was a small creek and some barbed wire fencing passing through it. We had it in place to try to deter the wolves and mountain lions in the area, and as we were sick of losing so many of our animals to them. It's technically illegal to set up wolf traps because it's considered inhumane, but my dad was just so angry that he just did it anyways, and that brings us to the worst night of my life. I passed through the barbed wire fence and through the creek. I made it about 40 or so feet into the forest before I heard a loud crunch and felt pressure on my ankle. I remember not understanding what the sound could have been and looking around for a possible source. I started to feel a burning sensation on my leg, and when I looked down, I saw one of the very large wolf traps clenched around and through my leg. The spikes were completely embedded into my skin, and the blood was oozing out from between the wounds. I began to scream from the pain, hoping someone would hear me and help me out of this, but I was in the middle of the forest with no one to help me for at least a mile. I felt myself getting lightheaded from the shock and blood loss, and I couldn't allow myself to pass out. This was a situation where I knew I would need all the time I could get before bleeding out. I knew the only thing out of this would be someone finding me, but that would also mean waiting. My dad didn't let me have a cell phone, so calling someone was out of the question, which meant my only hope was Jimmy noticing that I didn't show up and calling my dad. I took off my tank top and tied it around my leg to try and stop the bleeding. At that point, I could no longer feel my toes. I couldn't feel my foot at all. I tried prying open the trap, but as a very skinny teenage boy, that was just not going to happen. I sat there for about an hour trying to figure out a way out of this, and the only thing I could think of was that I could either wait for someone to notice I was missing, or I could muster up the courage and strength I had left in me and begin to crawl back toward my house. Thankfully, my dad's laziness was actually a good thing for once, as he'd not bolted the trap down. It had started getting dark at that point, so I reached into my backpack and grabbed the pajama shirt I had packed and put it on. I knew moving at night was not an option. I needed to see where I was going, if I was going to be dragging this heavy trap attached to my leg as I crawled. I found a fairly large tree nearby, and an agonizing pain crawled over to it. I propped myself up against it and couldn't prevent my eyes from shutting out of pure exhaustion. I woke up to the sound of snapping branches nearby. I looked around, but it was pitch black and I could see nothing. I took out my disposable camera and took pictures with the flash, pointing it in every direction to see what was out there. I shook in terror when I saw two glowing eyes staring back at me in the distance, and some distant howling. It was so loud I would have bet my life that those wolves were standing right next to me, and the night went on for what felt like days. I managed to stay awake until the morning light started to peek through the trees, and I was relieved that there were no longer any animals surrounding me in my very vulnerable state. I had lost all movement in my lower half of my leg, but the pain was still there in full force. I slung my backpack onto my back and took a deep breath before getting onto my hands and knees and starting to crawl back. The weight of the trap dragging behind me as it pulled on my leg was almost unbearable. It felt like something was trying to saw my leg off with a rusty butter knife. Every inch I moved felt like absolute torture, but I had to press on. I had finally made it the 40 feet that it was to the creek, and then came to another obstacle. The creek was shallow enough to walk through no problem, but crawling would be another story. As I entered the water, it was just deep enough to cover my mouth, and my only source of breath was through my nose. The water splashed as I crawled, and I would panic each time some of it entered my nose, thinking I was going to drown before I made it back onto the farm where my dad could possibly see me. That wasn't the case, though. I made it through the creek and took deep breaths, relieved to have survived that part of the horrible journey I found myself on. I started to crawl toward the barbed wire fence and screamed in pain when the trap got caught on a rock, basically cutting away at my leg as I unknowingly began pulling it apart. At that point, it started to feel like it was hopeless. I contemplated giving up. I felt like I was dying and there was going to be no way I'd actually make it home. In 4 hours, I'd only made it about 50 feet. I lifted my leg from the rock and stared at the fencing in front of me. I knew there was no way I could climb over, so under was my only option. I tried lifting the fencing as I squeezed underneath, but there was nothing I could have done to stop the barbs from digging into the skin on my back. The pain on my back was bad, but somehow distracted me from the pain in my leg. As bizarre as it sounds, it kind of gave me some relief. And inch by inch, I made my way closer to the house. I was at the crops again, looking at the plants that I admired only the day before that now made me angry to even look at. It was a reminder I was still somewhat far from home, from my salvation. I was covered in dirt, sweat, and blood, but the second I could begin to see the frame of my house, I was determined to live. I began picking up the pace as best I could and dragged myself by my elbows that were now scraped and bloodied beyond recognition. When I finally made it to the steps outside my house, my body was completely shot, and the last thing I remember was my dad yelling when he found me. My foot had to be amputated, and I was in the hospital for a few months from the infections that I ended up getting. My dad was fined for the traps and was forced to dispose of all the ones around the property. My cousin never thought to call my dad that night, as he just figured that I got in trouble or got grounded and he just continued doing what he was doing, and he's always felt really, really bad about it. I don't blame him, though. And even though the experience was horrible, I wouldn't change a thing. It showed me what it means to be alive, and I couldn't be more grateful for the lessons that I've learned. I'm a 15-year-old male, but was around 7 years old at the time that this happened, so please excuse if something doesn't exactly make much sense. It's hard to remember things from when I was that young, and I still do have PTSD from the entire thing. Before I tell you what happened that day, I guess I'll explain how we even found ourselves in that position in the first place. My dad was the kind of guy who, when he sets his mind on something, he had to do it, and there was no talking him out of it. I know it annoyed my mom, but she always supported him on all his ventures, because of love or whatever. So when my dad said he wanted to buy a farm and grow wheat for a living, my mom wasn't completely shocked. My dad had saved up a lot of money from his old job as a car salesman, and he already had a house picked out for us. My mom only told me recently that she was frustrated that my dad didn't take into consideration how she felt about it. But the day after he suggested it to her, they listed the old house anyways. And it sold relatively quickly, and my mom and dad only had a couple of weeks to pack up the home that they lived in throughout their whole marriage. My mom said when we got to the farm, it was just a total disaster. The house was in shambles with dust everywhere, and the land looked like it had been a place for BMX bikers to ride with tracks and small hills everywhere. Over the course of a few months, my dad managed to level all the fields and partially fix up the house before beginning to run out of the savings that he'd had. My mom had no idea at the time that they were broke, but figured something was up when all her expensive jewelry went missing. She found out later that he had sold it to pay for the huge tractor he bought. My mom started to become unhappy in the marriage and felt like all Dad cared about was his dreams and never her feelings. She continued to put on a brave face, though, for me and basically just sucked it up. My dad worked all day and night in the fields to prepare for the crops that he planned to eventually grow. But there was always seeming to be something preventing him. The soil wasn't nutrient-dense enough, there wasn't enough direct sunlight, the neighbors' goats kept coming onto our fields, there wasn't enough daylight to sow the seeds, the tractor needed fixing, etc., etc. Eventually, my mom gave him an ultimatum: start the crops within a week, or we're moving back into the city where he could get a proper job again. She hated being on the farm, and she knew that he was a big-time procrastinator, so she figured he wouldn't do it and we'd be back in the city where life would be good again within about a month. But with utter shock and complete disappointment, she was wrong. He got straight to work the next day on the tractor, tilling the earth to prepare for seeding. She told me she was hoping he would recognize her desperation to escape that place and finally put her feelings first, but she was wrong. After 3 days, he began sowing the seeds. He was out in the middle of the field that day when his tractor stopped working. Mom could see it smoking from where she was standing inside the house, so she called out to him to ask if everything was okay. He yelled from across the field and assured her that it was all good. Then she told me to go outside to see if he needed some help. I walked outside into the fields towards my dad and asked him if he needed me to do anything. He told me he was going to check the tractor for anything that needed fixing and told me that I could sit in it for a while if I wanted to while he did his thing. Of course I said yes. I was a 7-year-old kid. What little kid that age wouldn't want to sit in a tractor? My dad helped me climb up, and for the next 15 or so minutes I sat there looking at the levers and buttons while my dad walked around the tractor looking for the problem that was causing it to malfunction. He told me not to touch anything while I sat there, and I kept my promise for the time being. But it was just bigger than me, I guess. I pulled on one of the levers and felt the tractor lurch backward quickly in one swift motion. My dad grunted, and I heard a thud, but I didn't think anything of it. I hopped out of the tractor and looked back and saw half of my dad's body pinned beneath the tractor tire. He was still aware and talking and told me to get Mom. I ran as fast as I could back to the house and burst in the door. Now, at 7 years old, I had no knowledge of how to contain my emotions at a time of emergency. I had tears running down my face, and the best way my mom could describe how I sounded was a crying, mumbling mess. I was trying so hard to tell her what happened, but the words just wouldn't come out, so instead of talking, I just started to point outside toward the tractor. She seemed to understand it was something urgent having to do with Dad when she quickly ran to the door toward the field. Poor Mom was struggling to get over to him. The ground was heavily broken up from the tractor, and she kept failing in her attempt to get to him. By the time she finally got there, I saw her drop to her knees. I made my way over to them as fast as I could. My dad was telling her everything was going to be okay while she cried, leaning over him. She kept saying how she couldn't live without him and she needed him to survive. He had begun to not make much sense in his words, but I could tell even at that age that he was trying to say that he loved her. My mom, determined to save his life and not thinking logically, got in the tractor and managed to drive it off of him. This obviously only made it worse. His lower body was a mangled mess and he was losing blood fast. From what I could see, his legs were almost completely flattened and bones were sticking out of his flesh. My mom told me to look away, but to tell my dad that I loved him. I had no idea what to do. I couldn't speak, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't look away. That day, my dad took his last breath, and soon after, my mom rushed inside to call the police. When the paramedics got there, they told my mom that there was nothing anyone could have done to save him. My mom has tried telling me ever since that his death wasn't my fault, and that I was just a child. But for years, and all I've gone through, and all the therapy that I pushed myself through, I know in my heart that I killed my dad that day. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/Let'sReadOfficial, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks offered for the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, loose skin, but tight minds.